Two passengers judged the airline's owner without knowing he was sitting right in front of them. What happens next will change everything. The hum of the cabin filled the air as the passengers settled into their seats. The plane was stationed at the gate in Phoenix, Arizona, ready to embark on its journey to Seattle. Among the travelers was an unassuming man in his mid-40s, casually dressed in a navy blue polo and khaki slacks. His name? Samuel Pierce, a name few passengers would recognize, though he was far from ordinary. Samuel was the CEO and founder of Ascend Airways, a rising star in the aviation industry. But there was no fanfare for him today, and that's exactly how he liked it. For Samuel, these flights weren't just routine checks. They were opportunities to experience his creation as an ordinary customer. He always opted for an economy-class seat, believing that the heart of his airline service could be judged not by its first-class perks, but by how the everyday traveler was treated. Samuel's rise to prominence hadn't been easy. As a black man in an industry dominated by long-standing power structures, his journey had been filled with skepticism, obstacles, and outright prejudice. Yet through grit and determination, he built something remarkable. A company where customers could feel respected, regardless of who they were or where they came from. This particular flight was no different for Samuel. He boarded quietly, greeted the crew with a subtle nod, and took his place near the rear of the plane. Around him were families, business people and retirees, all too busy with their own lives to pay him any attention. That anonymity brought him a sense of freedom. But little did he know this flight would be anything but ordinary. The air carried the familiar buzz of pre-departure activity. Overhead bins slamming shut, safety announcements echoing faintly in the background, and flight attendants making last-minute checks. Samuel leaned back, gazing out the window. He always found comfort in these moments, when the world seemed to pause just before takeoff. But even the quietest of moments have a way of setting the stage for something unexpected. The engines roared to life, a low, steady rumble vibrating through the cabin as the plane taxied toward the runway. Samuel tightened his seatbelt, his mind already slipping into observation mode. He noticed the subtle details others might overlook, the way the flight attendants moved efficiently down the aisle, the hushed tones of passengers whispering about their plans, and even the crisp appearance of the seatback materials, recently updated to match his vision of comfort. To Samuel, every detail mattered. He had built Ascend Airways on the principle that even the smallest gestures, an extra warm smile from the crew, a seat cushion that felt just right, or a carefully selected in-flight snack, could transform a passenger's experience. He had fought to embed this ethos into every layer of the company, and these quiet flights gave him a chance to see if it truly resonated with his customers. As the plane climbed higher, the passengers around him began to settle in. A young woman 2 rows ahead juggled her restless toddler, using an iPad to distract him with a colorful cartoon. Across the aisle, an elderly man flipped through a paperback novel, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. A few rows behind Samuel, laughter erupted from a pair of friends, their excitement bubbling over in animated conversation. The air was light-hearted, filled with the diverse hum of human stories converging at 30,000 feet. It was exactly what Samuel loved most about flying. No matter where you came from, once you boarded, you became part of a shared experience, moving together toward a common destination. But it wasn't just the ambience Samuel noticed. He kept an ear tuned to the way the flight attendants interacted with passengers, their tone polite but firm as they enforced safety protocols. Every detail was filed away in his mind, a mental checklist of what was working and what could improve. Halfway through the flight, as the drink cart rattled its way down the aisle, Samuel leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. His thoughts wandered to how far he'd come. From a young boy dreaming of planes in his grandmother's backyard in Birmingham, Alabama, to owning an airline with routes spanning coast to coast. It still felt surreal. Yet the journey hadn't been without its scars. He couldn't forget the countless doubters who questioned whether someone like him could lead such a business. Some had laughed outright at the idea. Others had quietly dismissed him as a dreamer, with no real chance of succeeding. But Ascend Airways was now thriving, with its unmistakable logo of a golden feather proudly displayed on every tail fin. Samuel's quiet determination had proven them all wrong. But sometimes, the very spaces meant to unite people reveal the divides they carry within them. Samuel had just finished sipping his orange juice when he heard it. A faint murmur from the row behind him caught his attention, not loud enough for the entire cabin to notice, but unmistakably clear in the small bubble of economy class. Two voices, casual yet cutting, were deep in conversation. "I heard the owner of this airline is black," one of them said, her tone somewhere between curiosity and skepticism. "Not that it matters, but... I mean, how often do you see that? Running an airline?" The other voice chimed in, a man's, low and dismissive. "Yeah, well, good for him, I guess. But let's be real. How long do you think it'll last? These kinds of things always seem to fall apart when someone's trying to prove a point instead of just running a business." Samuel froze, his hand resting on the armrest. He wasn't shocked by the sentiment. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered it. But there was something different about hearing it spoken so openly, with him sitting right there, a silent witness. He fought the urge to turn around, to look them in the eye and say something, anything. But instead, he stayed still, letting their words pour over him. "I mean, don't get me wrong," the woman continued, her voice taking on a lighter tone, as though trying to justify herself. "The flight's nice enough. Seats are comfortable and the staff is friendly, but you know how these things go. Let's see if it's still around in a few years." Samuel's stomach tightened. Their words weren't outright hateful, but they carried a weight that was just as damaging. Doubt. The kind of doubt that wasn't born of experience but of assumptions, baked into the fabric of how they saw the world. He tried to focus on something else. The faint hum of the engines, the flight attendant offering coffee a few rows ahead, but the conversation kept pulling him back in. It wasn't just about him. It was about everything he stood for, everything he had worked to build. The unspoken barriers he'd fought to break through felt as if they had materialized right here in the row behind him. "I guess we'll see," the man said with a chuckle. "I mean, good luck to him. But honestly, if it were me, I'd stick to something smaller. Restaurants or something. Airlines are a whole different game." Samuel's hands clenched under his tray table. Restaurants. Something smaller. The words swirled in his mind, striking a chord that was equal parts frustration and determination. He had heard it all before, but hearing it now, on his airline from his customers, was something else entirely. But Samuel knew that reacting emotionally wouldn't solve anything. He needed to take this moment and turn it into something bigger. Samuel stared out the window, the clouds below looking like an endless ocean of white. His heart was racing, his thoughts tangled in a web of emotions. Part of him wanted to stand up, turn around and confront them, ask them what made them so quick to doubt someone they didn't even know. But another part of him held back, reminding him that anger wouldn't change their minds. Words might. Action would. He took a deep breath, grounding himself. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered prejudice disguised as casual conversation. It had happened in boardrooms, in interviews, even in social settings where people assumed their opinions wouldn't reach his ears. But hearing it here, on a flight that represented his life's work, struck deeper than he expected. It wasn't just an attack on his abilities, it was a challenge to the very foundation of his vision. Samuel's mind raced as he replayed their words, dissecting the layers of ignorance within them. It wasn't the outright malice of hatred. It was the quieter, more insidious disbelief in what someone like him could achieve. It was a doubt that came wrapped in politeness, the kind that didn't scream but whispered, undermining everything he had built. What was the right thing to do here? Should he let it go? Let their words dissolve into the air as just another example of the uphill climb he'd faced his whole life? Or should he use this moment to make a statement, not for his ego, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or doubted? Samuel glanced around the cabin. The young mother was now reading a magazine as her toddler dozed on her shoulder. The elderly man across the aisle had set his book aside and was quietly sipping his tea. The two friends behind him had settled into a more subdued rhythm, flipping through a shared travel guide. Life went on around him, oblivious to the storm raging in his chest. He thought about his grandmother, who had always told him that people's doubts were never about him. They were about themselves. "Don't let their fears shape your reality, Samuel," she would say. "You decide who you are, not them." Those words had carried him through countless trials, and now they surfaced again, steadying him in the face of the quiet storm brewing in row 21. He reached for the call button but paused, his finger hovering above it. If he spoke now, he needed to make it count. It couldn't come from a place of anger or bitterness. It had to come from the same place that had driven him to build Ascend Airways in the first place, a place of hope, determination, and unshakable belief in the power of change. But the question lingered. How could he turn this moment into something meaningful, something that would stay with them long after the plane touched down? Samuel inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of his decision settle in his chest. He pressed the call button, signaling for a flight attendant. A young man named Luis approached, smiling politely. "Can I help you with something?" Luis asked. Samuel nodded. "Would it be possible for me to make a brief announcement over the intercom? I promise it won't take long." Luis hesitated, unsure. "Usually, that's reserved for the crew." Samuel pulled out a sleek black card from his pocket, the one he rarely showed anyone unless necessary. It bore the golden feather logo of Ascend Airways, along with his title, CEO and Founder. Luis's eyes widened slightly as he processed what this meant. He nodded, quickly walking toward the front of the cabin to clear it with the captain. Moments later, the intercom crackled to life. Samuel stood, turning to face the cabin. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of his emotions. "Good afternoon, everyone. This is Samuel Pierce, founder of Ascend Airways. I don't usually make announcements like this, but today, I feel compelled to share something with you." The cabin grew silent, passengers pausing their conversations and activities. Even the two behind him quieted, their curiosity piqued. "When I started this airline, many people told me it wasn't possible. They said someone like me, someone who didn't come from privilege, someone who didn't fit the mold of what they thought success looked like, couldn't build something like this. But I didn't let those doubts stop me, and I'm proud to say Ascend Airways is here because of hard work, belief, and the support of people who dared to dream with me." Samuel paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the passengers. Some looked intrigued, others thoughtful. He continued, his tone softening but remaining firm. "Today, I overheard a conversation that reminded me why I started this journey in the first place. It wasn't just about creating an airline. It was about challenging the assumptions we sometimes carry without realizing it. Assumptions about who belongs, who can lead, and who can succeed. These assumptions aren't just words. They have power. They shape the way we see the world and each other." A few heads nodded in quiet agreement, the weight of his words settling in the air. "I want to leave you with this. Greatness doesn't have a single face, a single background, or a single story. It belongs to anyone willing to work for it, anyone who dares to believe they can rise above the doubts of others. So, as you go about your journey today, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect, not just on what you see, but on what you might not have seen before." The cabin was silent. Even the faint hum of the engines seemed muted against the gravity of his words. Samuel smiled gently. "Thank you for choosing Ascend Airways. We're honored to be a part of your journey." He handed the intercom back to Luis and took his seat, feeling a mix of nervousness and relief. But the silence that followed wasn't just a lack of noise. It was the sound of people thinking, processing, and perhaps beginning to see the world a little differently. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin felt different. Passengers who had previously been immersed in their own distractions were now exchanging glances, some whispering to their neighbors about the unexpected announcement. Samuel remained seated, calm and composed, though his heart still carried the weight of the moment. The two passengers behind him, the ones whose conversation had sparked his speech, were unusually quiet. He could sense their discomfort, but also their curiosity. They hadn't yet connected the man in front of them with the voice on the intercom, and Samuel preferred it that way, for now. The plane landed smoothly at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, drawing a round of polite applause from a few passengers. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Samuel stood, retrieving his carry-on from the overhead compartment. He was one of the first to step into the aisle, his presence unassuming, yet now the focus of a few curious eyes. When the doors opened and passengers began filing out, Samuel made his way to the front of the cabin, where Luis and the other flight attendants stood bidding farewell. Instead of exiting, Samuel turned to stand beside them, offering his hand to passengers as they disembarked. "Thank you for flying with us," he said, his voice warm and sincere. The elderly man who had been reading his book earlier stopped briefly, looking at Samuel with a faint smile. "That was quite a speech," he said, shaking Samuel's hand firmly. "It's good to see someone with your vision leading this company. Keep going." "Thank you," Samuel replied, his voice carrying genuine gratitude. As more passengers filed past, the two from the row behind him finally approached. Their eyes darted between him and the flight attendants, realization dawning slowly but unmistakably. "You," the woman began, her voice faltering. "You're the CEO?" Samuel nodded, his expression kind but steady. "I am. I'm also a passenger today, just like you." The man's face flushed, and for a moment he seemed unsure of what to say. Finally, he managed, I didn't mean anything by what I said earlier. I guess I just wasn't thinking." Samuel met his eyes, holding his gaze without a trace of anger. "We all have moments like that. The important thing is what we take from them." The woman nodded, her expression softening. "Your airline's amazing. I mean that. And your message, it really made me think." Samuel offered a small smile. "That's all I can ask." As they walked away, he could see the subtle shift in their body language, heads slightly lowered, steps slower, their expressions thoughtful. But it wasn't just about them. The ripple of that moment extended to everyone on board, a reminder that change starts when we're willing to confront our own assumptions. As the last of the passengers exited the plane, Samuel took a moment to reflect. This flight had been like so many others, until it wasn't. The words he overheard, the decision to speak, and the reactions he witnessed, all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle. It wasn't just about proving himself or defending his success. It was about planting a seed, one that might grow into a broader understanding of what's possible when barriers are challenged and stereotypes are shattered. Walking through the airport terminal, Samuel felt lighter. He thought about the countless others who had been underestimated, doubted, or overlooked. His journey was only one story, but he knew it could inspire others to tell their own. Every voice mattered. Every action, no matter how small, carried the potential to shift perspectives. As Samuel approached the exit, he noticed a young boy holding his mother's hand, staring at a billboard for Ascend Airways. The boy's eyes lit up, and he tugged at his mother's arm. "Mom, do you think I could fly a plane someday?" The woman smiled warmly. "Of course you can. You can do anything." Samuel's heart swelled. This was why he had started Ascend Airways. Not just for the business, but for moments like this. To show the next generation that dreams were valid, no matter where they came from or who dreamed them. To anyone watching, it was just another day at the airport. But for Samuel, It was a reminder that change didn't always come with grand gestures. Sometimes it started with a conversation, an idea, or a simple acknowledgement of possibility. So, what about you? What assumptions do you carry? What limits do you place on yourself or others? Let this story be a challenge to look deeper, to listen more carefully, and to believe in something greater than doubt. If this resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection and growth. Together, we can build a world where everyone has the chance to soar.